So I was asked for this session to sort of revisit this research I did a couple years back on northeastern North America, Quebec boreal forest being in a potential refugium for under a warming climate. So I put together three things here. The first one is summarizing what this research had found. Yeah, so that was the title of that article. And then I'm sort of revisiting it now, this time using permanent sample plot data. The first article was published in 2016 using tree rings. And this time I'm looking at kind of the same results, expanding on multiple species, but using a network of American and Canadian permanent sample plot data, sort of expanding south into the warmer climate of the US. And if I have time, hopefully I do, I'll briefly talk about a new project I have going on called Transx. It's a new assisted migration trial for northeastern forest. So yeah, a lot on my plate, so I'll just get started. So first, this tree ring analysis we did. Just a quick introduction on the why of this research. A couple of things you probably know already, that the boreal forest is planned to be the forest ecosystem with the fastest and highest warming because it's just closest to the poles. And growth in the boreal forest is generally understood to be limited by low temperatures because it's a very cold ecosystem, so you have a short growing season. But there's more to that. As the IPCC put it earlier, these increases that we're expecting to see in productivity should only happen in areas that are not water limited. So if there's enough water to sustain an increased productivity due to warming, you will see that increased productivity. Now, which areas are water limited and which are not? That was the question we tried to tackle. And of course, this is a very, it's not a one-size-fits-all species, if you follow what I mean. So it's very species specific, and then it should help inform adaptive management, including assisted migration initiatives. If you know where the indigenous populations, species can thrive or not thrive, then it can guide management initiatives. So methods, we used this new collection of scanned tree cores from the inventory database of the Quebec province. We're talking about 26,000 trees, black spruce trees cored from 16,000 stands, covering most of the commercial forest of Quebec, so the temperate, mixed, and boreal forest. However, there were no accurate dating of these growth rings, so they were not cross-dated. So we had to develop this new automated protocol to filter out the poorly dated cores and only keep and only create these chronologies out of well-correlated tree rings. That method was actually published in a journal in 2017. And so we created these regional chronologies. We validated them against independent chronologies from previous researchers available from the International Treeing Database, and then ran some correlations with seasonal climate for 1960-2004. So this is what it looks like in terms of location of the tree rings that we use. So the top map you see on the right, every green dot is a stand that was sampled. Those big black circles you see are just the value of the correlations with independent chronologies, showing some pretty good correlations. And so, of course, this is the map of Quebec. So the southern end of it is really pure temperate forest, but you still have some black spruce trees in there, and you have the mixed forest that up the north, it's pure boreal forest dominated by black spruce. So you have this whole range of climate and stand types as well. And the lower panel you see on that figure is just the all the single chronologies, all on top, one on top of the other, from 1960 to 2004. And that big jump you see in the middle of the 70s is the spruce budworm outbreak. So results. So we're just talking about correlations of these chronologies and we have thousands with seasonal climate, okay? And so what we did is we ran these correlations with climatic moisture index, precipitation, and temperature, and sort of mapped these correlations on the map of the study area, where we put, you know, different colors for positive or negative correlations. I'll show you an example right now. So this is the growth correlation with spring available water. And so you recognize on the map, this is the Quebec region. And each circle you see is a correlation with the chronology. Now, the darker circles, blue with a black outline, blue or red represent significant correlations. Blue mean positive, red mean negative. And you see a clear spatial trend here, where in the southwest, which is drier and warmer, wet springs favor growth, are correlated with positively with growth. But in the weather colder areas, wet springs reduce the growth of trees, which suggests that those trees in the colder and wetter actually don't enjoy water in spring. They like it dry because there's because water is not limiting. And if you look at another season, let's say summer available water here, what you see is significant positive correlations constrained to the southern areas where it's actually warmer. So you see less of this positive effect as you go north. Now, there's a lot of these results we gathered. This is just a glimpse of how many of these results we put together. But I'm not going to go over this. I'm just going to go over quickly a summary figure where we combine all the seasonal results into one simple figure, the fraction of positive correlations to climate from south to north. This is what it looks like. So on the x-axis, you have the latitude. So as you move to the right to higher latitudes, you go into colder climates. And on the y-axis, you have those percent of positive correlation. So if you start with just the red line, the red curve is the amount of positive correlations with temperature, and you see that it increases as you move north, meaning the colder the climate, the more positive the effect of warmer temperature. Okay, and vice versa with precip and moisture index. So the further north you go, the less positive increasing precipitation and moisture have an effect on growth. So we concluded with this idea that we saw, like in the southern region, water limited area, where the warm and dry years reduce growth, and in the north it was more of a temperature limited area, where the warm and dry years favor growth. So a contrast, right? And this had us conclude, maybe going a little too far for some people, that it was in some way that northern area of northeastern North America was some sort of climatic refugium, because at least in that area, trees responded positively to increasing temperatures and reduced precipitation or available moisture. So, which in my mind makes sense. Of course, there's many limitations. We'll get back to that. And interestingly enough, there's this recent paper that just got accepted in Forest Ecology and Management. I was not involved in that result, but they did a meta-analysis of also the Quebec region, 10 studies, 110 study sites, tree rings, and they found exactly the same results. So for June and July, growth limitation by precip in the south and by temperature in the north. You see it on the right side panel. I don't know if you see my arrow, but that June temperature effect shift from negative in the south to positive in the north. So pretty consistent results there. Now, revisiting this idea of refugium, we did the same work with permanent sample plot data. Okay, I'll skip the methods. I'll go straight to the results. This is just a map of where those permanent sample plots are located. It took us quite a while to compile everything together. And this is just an example of what the model suggests in terms of, individual effects of, in this case, you have summer Tmax, summer precip, competition, frost-free period by species on a basal area increment. And then we run our models with the climate projected for 2040, 2060. And this is the result by species. I won't go through everything, but the blue suggests increasing growth, the yellow decreasing growth. And if you focus on the black spruce, if you remember what we saw in the previous study, we see exactly the same trend, a sort of south to north reverse of the effect of warming on growth. So actually you have an increasing growth in the north and a decreasing growth in the south. And now we expand with this study to across the boreal forest of Canada. So a net positive increase in growth overall, of course, in the absence of disturbances, declines associated with warmer and drier locations, and you have large species differences. White spruce is really the biggest loser in this story, except in the northeastern boreal forest of Quebec. So quick conclusions about this. I mean, we see in general gains in growth for parts of the Canadian boreal forest, which support this idea of a refugium, at least for a while, of course, which could offset some of the increasing disturbance impacts. And that's an important point. There's a lot of things we don't include in this analysis. Species display large variations in their capacity to acclimate to a warmer climate, which would also inform management and assisted migration, right? Some species need it more than others. And of course, we could write a book, on the limitations of these projections. There's no disturbances, there's no community dynamics, competition, there's no genetics, no accounting for how various populations, ecotypes can, adapt differently or acclimate differently to warming, stem development, etc. Right? Quickly, I'll just finish off with introducing TransX, this assisted migration trial. So it's assessing the warming vulnerability in northeastern tree species and assisted migration potential. We're setting up, actually plantation will occur next year, but on the right on the map, you see the trial locations. So there's a couple in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia. It goes in Maine, Quebec, Petawawa, Ontario, and one in Indiana and Duke. And I'm working right now on finding one in Midway, maybe in southern Vermont or Connecticut in some areas. So the objectives are to assess the warming tolerance of local hardwood and softwood species by moving them south into warmer areas, but also assess how, assisted migration capacity of the same species by moving southern populations north. And finally, there's a sort of a tree improvement component where we're going to be test driving improved progenies from Irving, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, white and red spruce across these sites. So there's just an example of the type of experimental design. We've got 5 broadleaf species, 5 coniferous species, mostly boreal, but we also have white pine. And we're going to set up air soil met stations, leaf, terminal growth phenology cameras, and deer fencing, because that's going to be a big issue. And collaborations are very welcome. If you're interested to work on this, looking at different aspects of this project, just send me an email. Thanks for listening, and Bonne Saint-Jean for our Québécois listeners in the room.
My name is Laura Bova Marsh. I'm a forest biologist at the Canadian Forest Service in Sault Ste. Marie. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about work today that's been led by the research scientists that I collaborate closely with, Isabelle Aubin. This work over the years has been through the Forest Change program of for the Canadian Forest Service. And also a little bit of this work that I'm going to present today was part of my PhD work through McGill. So I acknowledge the significant contributions of my co-authors today, and as well as a lot of collaborations over the years. So climate change is not some far off scenario. It's happening now, and the effects are noticeable. So climate influences the ability of plants to survive, reproduce, recruit, either directly by modifying the growing conditions to which they're used to, or indirectly through the effects of more severe drought, fire, flooding, insect rates, and extreme events. So to anticipate the potential impacts of these stressors on forest ecosystems and develop corresponding adaptation strategies, forestry practitioners are increasingly using climate-based vulnerability assessments. So these assessments rely heavily on exposure, which is in this case the degree of environmental change a species will experience. It's typically based on biophysical variables such as temperature and precipitation, usually the classic one being species distribution modeling. And the climate data that's available is usually at broad spatial scales that covers species distribution. But what we don't talk so much about is species sensitivity or their ability to adapt. So in recent years, several authors have pointed out critical gaps in this approach, notably the lack of ecological information underlying species responses to those stressors. So tree species response to climate change is expected to be quite variable, and the magnitude and nature of the response will depend on the traits of individual species. To identify mechanisms and traits that can explain differences in species intolerance and adaptive capacity, a multidisciplinary working group was created in 2013 by Isabelle and Allison, bringing together experts from a variety of fields within ecology. From this workshop, a review paper was written and published in 2016 that identified functional traits that underlie species' ability to persist in place, notably in their ability to either tolerate or cope with changes, or their ability to adapt, or their ability to move. And this is both considered at the individual scale and at the population scale, and how those traits underlie the relationship with the sensitivity, tolerance, ability to adapt. Two major projects stem from that review paper, and notably the ability to compare relative sensitivity or relative ability to adapt across species. So for the climate sensitivity project, which was one that I led, we developed a series of trait-based indices for 26 abundant tree species in Eastern Canada that capture a species' ability to cope with three key climate change stressors. So increased drought events and the link with mortality, shifts in climatically suitable habitat and the ability to keep up, and increased fire in intensity and frequency. To assess the ability to adapt, the work led by Samuel led to 5 indices that capture adaptation and adaptive capacity at different scales, from individuals to populations, and how it can happen across multiple time scales from years to centuries. So overall, all said and told, it took about 7 years between the various projects to survey the literature, mine the available information and data out there. And the other key part of this work was that both of the papers on sensitivity and adaptive capacity identified research gaps and assessed data confidence that preclude truly comprehensive assessments of ability to tolerate or adapt to climate change. So what we found when we break down these tree species responses to climate change is that you can appreciate the responses to stresses are more complicated than they appear. So aspen, use an example with trembling aspen. So aspen is drought sensitive at the individual level because of its shallow rooting habitat and its low resistance to xylem cavitation and the inability to maintain water conductance. But it's resilient at the population level because it has a high potential for vegetative reproduction and suckering after mortality, as well as its high potential for seed production, making it also an effective species to migrate. Same for fire sensitivity. Poplar is sensitive at the individual level tree because of its thin bark and shallow roots, but it can reestablish effectively after fire because of its potential for on-site reestablishment, as well as from seed sources on the periphery of the fire. Not only that, it has a relatively good capacity to adapt, mainly because we found that it has a high genetic diversity within populations and low genetic differentiation between populations, showing high potential for exchange of genetic material necessary for species to adapt. On the other hand, using black spruce can be considered drought sensitive because of its shallow rooting habit. But once drought is started, it has a better than average resistance to xylem cavitation. And I'll preface this by saying this is really just looking at the sensitivity of a species relative to others. This doesn't consider impacts, as Loic was showing in the last presentation, where it can be exposure can really vary depending on where you are. and for its migration capacity is not as effective. It can produce a lot of seeds. It can be, those seeds can be dispersed by animals and wind alike, but typically it's not at distances that are effective for reestablishing populations when you have to come from a peripheral source. And for fire, black spruce is a species that just wants the world to burn because it favors its regeneration. But as Jennifer pointed out in the plenary on Tuesday, generation failure is possible if the fire return interval is shorter than the age at which regenerating spruce actually starts producing seeds. So I'm going to switch focus and talk about one of the tools that was developed in the lab up through the PhD work that was used to integrate exposure to climate change risk and the sensitivity of species, notably the projected changes in species climatically suitable habitat and the ability of species to migrate in order to track those changes. So in the MindClim project, we developed a framework to assess capacity and to compare those simulated range shifts with changes in climate envelope limits under climate change scenario. So we use a data-driven method that integrates data from on species dispersal capacity, post-colonization regeneration time. And a key aspect of this work was the development of what I called a migration kernel. So typically dispersal kernels, when we talk about them, they are probability kernels are defined from field studies like seed traps, which are logistically and experimentally quite labor intensive and making it difficult to obtain species-specific kernels for a broad suite of species. Instead, the kernel that was developed with this work is that it takes readily information from the scientific literature to quantify the probability of those events, specifically common seed fall distance, which is often reported in silvicultural compendiums, but also migration velocity based on contemporary observations of range shifts, which is work that I had led in the past, but also incorporating paleological observations of range shifts. And to characterize long distance dispersal, we used a published regression model called dispersal, or it's implemented in R, that uses traits related to seed dispersal to estimate the distances over which long distance dispersal could occur. So simulations were run over 90 years at a 25-meter resolution across Eastern Canada, which is about 14 billion cells, but anyway. Climate projections were used from 2011 through to 2100 with 3 different projections. And we did 10 different tree species to see how different combinations of traits related to dispersal and generation time influence simulated migration patterns. So when we look at dispersal and generation time and incorporate that into species exposure, picture is really different. So looking at fine scale patterns of simulating areas that are newly colonized by some range extending event, it's really limited by long distance dispersal and generation time. So in the map that you see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the gray is the initial distribution and the colors from blue to green are the colonized cells through the model simulations. And as you can see with the 2 examples that I have here between the maple and the trembling aspen, species like sugar maple with a relatively short long distance dispersal and a fairly long generation time don't spread out very far over the 90 years of the simulation period. On average, when I did a random sampling of all these little areas here, it was only about 2.2 kilometers over a 90-year period. On the other hand, trembling aspen spreads out much more over the simulation period with distances that are much higher than sugar maple, and also a relatively short, fast generation time. At larger scales, like across Eastern Canada, the simulation showed that all species show some amount of northward range shift at the leading edge through the simulation period, but the magnitude and rate vary by species, time period, and the spatial scale at which those shifts are being considered. So not only did long distance dispersal and generation time influence the magnitude of range shift, but species with the highest range shifts that we found in the study and the model simulations were those with discontinuous distributions at the northern edge, which became filled in throughout the model runs. So again, the same example, the simulated range shift on the left here for sugar maple at the 99th percentile of latitude, which is like the very, very edge here, it was only about 15 kilometers through the 90-year period. Whereas aspen, if you see down here, had a lot more to fill in between. So, oh, sorry about that. Aspen had a lot more to fill in. So the simulated range shift was about 188 kilometers, or more to the order of 200. But as you can see in the white space here, the between the two species, the climate envelope shift projected for 2100 far exceeds the simulated range shift for all species, especially, as you can see here, for temperate species like sugar maple. Again, at the 99th percentile, so that edge here, it was close, for aspen, it was closer to 300 kilometers, whereas sugar maple was closer to 1,000 kilometers. And this model only looked at ability to disperse and colonize, and suitability of areas were only based on climate. This doesn't take into account competition, soil factors. Loic gave a great summary of what can prevent species from breaking through. And this is particularly important transitioning from the temperate forest to the boreal forest for species like sugar maple that really need to be able to keep up with their climate envelope, because it's shifting quite appreciably. Or for boreal species to break into the tundra, considering waterlogged soils and whatnot. So by combining information on sensitivity and adaptation, we can get a more complete portrait of how to approach adaptation measures. So if a species has an ability to persist or to adapt, persist, adapt, and migrate, well, it's not really a very big concern. And so we can focus on other species that may be of more important consideration. So if a species' ability to persist or adapt, maybe but not so good at effective at migrating, then one strategy might be to conserve in its current habitat. Whereas connectivity could be favored for those species that can't persist, can't really adapt, and then migrate. And then highlighting when none of these is effective, then these could be candidates for assisted migration. So with that, I highlight everyone who's been involved and many more over the years, and I'll be happy to take questions now or at the end. Thanks.
First of all, I want to acknowledge the great group of folks who is behind the research that I'll be talking about today. Colloquially, we refer to ourselves as Dream Wisconsin, which will make more sense after Patricia's talk after mine. And this group was formed in no small part due to inspiration from Patricia and colleagues' work in Quebec. So our Dream Wisconsin project is a multi-site assisted migration trial that aims to manipulate abiotic and biotic factors known to limit tree establishment. And the field component is still underway, and so we don't have results from that yet. But today I'll be speaking on results from a meta-analysis that we conducted to inform the development of this assisted migration trial, as well as hopefully be useful for other ongoing assisted migration trials. So as has already been mentioned, tree populations become increasingly maladapted to local climate conditions. They must migrate or adapt, but their ability to do so is often at odds with their long generation times or dispersal modes. Therefore, without any sort of intervention, climate change threatens the continued functioning and provisioning of ecosystem services like timber production. And so here is just, see if I can get my pointer. Here are just a few examples from the Great Lakes region where I work, in light blue of areas where species have had observed declines in abundance when we compare historical late 1800s, early 1900s data with contemporary FIA data. And so in response to these projected changes or threats to many tree species, assisted migration has emerged, of course, as a promising adaptive management tool. But many questions of its benefits and risks, I don't need to tell many of you this, but many questions remain in terms of its use and best practices. And of course, assisted migration also comes in a couple different flavors, whether we're doing short distance population or gene flow migration, or longer distance migration of species into completely novel habitats outside of their range. And any sort of long distance movement, whether it's natural or assisted in this case, will expose trees to novel variation in soil conditions, but also soil biota, the life in the soil and all of the sort of biological complications that come with that. And of course, there are many biotic, abiotic factors at play here, but for this talk, I'm going to focus on what's called plant soil feedbacks. So these are just the ways in which plants can modify their soil environment through depositing litter or through interactions with pathogens and mutualists and other soil organisms. And these effects that plants have on their soil feed back to affect subsequent growth of those plants. And so with that whole cycle, we get this plant soil feedback. And many studies, especially in herbaceous plant communities, have shown PCFs to have a fundamental role in a broad suite of functions, whether it's plant abundance, productivity, community assembly. So it's not a stretch to think that PCFs may act as a key constraint to tree migration and the effectiveness of getting trees established in novel environments. And so how these are studied, we quantify PCFs by quite simply growing trees. So in this case, species A, we grow it in its own soil and compare its performance to being grown in away soil from another species. This would be one way to get at PCFs. And then, simply we look at the ratio of those responses, whether it's growth, whether it's survival, and we can get an understanding, in this case, of what the species-specific biota, what effect it has on, say, species A, and likewise, if we do the same sort of contrast, species B. But there's another common manipulation, which is, again, using that home soil, but comparing it to sterile soil. And both of these approaches, the home away or the live sterile, give us sort of complementary information. They're both super simplified examples of the real world, but they give us information on the species-specific biota, and in the case of sterilization, just the net effect of all biota in the soil. So together, we can get information on how important soil biota are to the performance of trees. But this for us trying to predict impacts and inform practices, really interested in what may govern whether a tree is greatly positively impacted by soil biota or negatively impacted. And so, like Laura was talking about with traits, plant functional traits are one potential framework to understand patterns and try and predict them. And today I just want to mention two kind of main groups of focus. One is this growth defense trade-off that all plant species fall in. And on the extremes, we have fast-growing and on the other, slow-growing species. Fast-growing having poor investment in defense, typically, higher tissue nitrogen contents, faster growth rates. And typically, these are early colonizers when we're talking about trees that are typically pretty shade intolerant. Whereas slower-growing species, say many like oak species, will have higher investment in defensive compounds, lower leaf nitrogen, slower growth, and typically be a little bit more shade tolerant or later successional in their life habit. And then we also have sort of the way that these species acquire nutrients in the soil and the mycorrhizae that they associate with. And broadly speaking, trees typically fall in two camps: arbuscular mycorrhizae and ectomycorrhizal. And this is important because in the case of ectomycorrhizal tree species, like this oak, they will form, the fungi will form a protective sheath oftentimes around the roots, which can have beneficial effects to, prevent negative impacts of pathogens and other things, and provide sort of a protection against some of those negative PCFs. So going into this and prior to setting up this assisted migration trial, we had three main research questions we wanted to address with a meta-analysis. And so these three main questions were: first, how did just those different manipulations, home away soil contrast, live sterile home contrast, how do they affect the direction and strength of PCFs? How well do those growth defense traits explain variation, as well as mycorrhizal association? And with all of these questions, taking studies from the literature, our measure of plant performance was just growth, defined as change in biomass, height, or diameter of the trees being grown. And I won't go into details, but basically the response was growth in home versus away soils, or live versus sterile. And then those three main components I mentioned as fixed effects in our model, with some random effects such as study and focal species. And so before I display the results here, just to orient you a little bit, on the X, we have that response ratio of our home versus away soils, or live versus sterile soils. And less than 1 indicates that trees performed worse in their home than away soils. And conversely, greater than 1 values mean a positive PCF. And here we have the points color-coded by whether they're AM or EM species. And basically what we found was, from about 26 publications that we pulled from, the direction and magnitude of PCFs really varied with mycorrhizal guild, most importantly, with AM species experiencing mostly negative PCFs and EM experiencing mostly positive. And the magnitude here is fairly large, with AM experiencing up to 26% declines in growth, whereas ectomycorrhizal can experience, we found some up to about 70% increase in their growth rates. So pretty sizable effects. And when we look at growth defense traits, we found more mixed evidence and less obvious patterns. So here we're just flipping the response ratio onto the y-axis, but again, greater than 1 positive, less than 1 negative. And I say mixed because the leaf traits, we didn't find strong patterns guiding that. We didn't find the expected pattern of fast-growing, high leaf nitrogen species experiencing more negative PCFs. But we did find what we expected when it comes to plant height and some of the below ground traits, interestingly enough. So some evidence that those traits, and depending on which ones you pull from, can be valuable for understanding patterns. And so to take a step back and just sort of think about what the main takeaways here are. So like I said, tree growth we found was greatly affected by PCFs. They were important for these Eastern North American tree species, with effects ranging from 26% reduction to 68% gain in growth. And if we just kind of divide some example species into these buckets of arbuscular versus ectomycorrhizal and slow versus fast growing, we can see that we can gather some general expectations of ectomycorrhizal slow growing species like white spruce may benefit the most from inoculum that is species specific or has a lot of those beneficial mutualisms. Whereas something like black locust, a sort of classic weedy species in some areas, is really negatively affected by its own soil biota, and therefore is quite good at invading these new novel environments. And So when it comes to developing these assisted migration trials, this work really suggests there's sort of a hierarchy of needs. So as Laura was talking about, kind of the first and most important step is selecting your tree species based on their projected maladaptation to climate, their soil requirements, as well as their adaptability, how well they can adapt and disperse. And then secondly, finding and identifying seed sources that say preserve genetic diversity and match with the soil requirements of a given species and its climate analog. And a big one there, logistical challenges, which if you've done seed sourcing, you will relate to that. And then finally, though, just adding this sort of additional layer of not having biotic factors be this giant black box that we don't explore and develop assisted migration trials to investigate some questions herein, but biotic factors that may be important, such as mismatches of the soil community, and using a trait-based framework to better identify species that will be successful in establishing. And then finally, I'll just leave you with a few future directions that I feel like from this work we can fold into assisted migration trials that we are developing. First and foremost, I'll just point out a couple. Data from field conditions. These were all primarily greenhouse studies, so more real-world field conditions. And finally, if patterns hold for rare species, everything in this meta-analysis was common, abundant tree species. So do the patterns exist for others as well? I think I'm over. So with that, I will thank you and go to the next speaker. Thank you all.
Okay, here we go. Let's dive in it now. Okay. So, yes, this project, I have many collaborators that I want to acknowledge. Well, I'll skip that part because I'm already behind. So climate change is expected to modify the distribution of favorable tree habitats, as you know, which typically translates in habitat losses in the south and potential gains in the north. Especially, well, actually in the northern hemisphere. However, these habitat changes are likely to occur at a faster pace than the speed of the natural migration of tree species, like Laura nicely highlighted earlier. Yet the question, can we help the species and populations migrate? It looks like the animation is not working. Okay, yes, it does. Okay. Let's go. When thinking about how to apply assisted migration in the field, more questions arise. How to integrate this in the current practices and what will be the main constraints to the success of these plantings? Questions we have. In the temperate conditions in which I'm working, the browsing by cervids, pests, adverse climatic conditions, and interspecific competition may affect the seedling acclimation, survival, and growth. Actually, this is what the DREAM network is studying. DREAM stands for Desired Regeneration Through Assisted Migration. This is a network as a cross-border effort with partners from the USDA Forest Service, namely Alex Royo and Crystal Kern, the government of Quebec, Université Laval, and other agencies and universities. Our first experiment was implemented in Quebec in 2018, and a second one is currently being implemented in Wisconsin, was what Tyler was talking about. So the DREAM Quebec project was established in the yellow birch balsam fir bioclimatic domain, which represents the temperate mixed wood forest there. It was implemented in stands degraded by past inappropriate practices, but with good site growth potential. So our objectives were to assess in operational conditions migration of tree species and climate analogs in order to promote the resiliency and adaptability to climate change. We also wish to improve quality and productivity of these degraded stands. And ultimately, we want to develop silvicultural scenarios incorporating assisted migration for the practitioners. So the DREAM approach differs from other assisted migration trials in that these plantings consider and manipulate three factors known to strongly affect the seedling success, like light levels, the served herbivory, and the understory competition. So we use a split plot design to test the effects of treatments and of their interactions. First, we have plantings in open conditions of the patch clear cuts versus that we compare to plantings under the partial cover of shelterwood treatments. Then each main plot was divided in two to assess the effects of herbivory. So half of it was fenced and the other half was not fenced. And then these subplots were divided again to compare the effects of vegetation control. The vegetation control treatment was a mechanical release made with a brush saw during the second growing season. Finally, each of these three treatment combinations were further divided in three to plant seedlings of three geographic provenances. Seedlings whose seed origin is local, so adapted to current climate. Seedlings grown with seeds from location where the climate conditions are analog to the one anticipated at the mid-century for a study site, and seeds from locations where climate conditions are analog to the ones modeled at the end of the century. So as a result, we have seeds of current climate come from the Quebec City greater area in green on this map. Mid-century analogs are from southern Quebec, mostly eastern townships, and the late century analogs come from the northeastern United States and the Nova Scotia. The large stock seedlings were all grown at the Berthierville Provincial Tree Nursery. So we planted 10,000 seedlings approximately in this experiment. 8 species were planted in August 2018, and one was planted afterwards, a Caryavata, which was longer to produce at the tree nursery. So these, there's a spider like this. Okay, it's gone. Okay, so now 3 species. In 6 cases, we are studying the assisted population migration with species for whose habitat conditions are anticipated to be not very good, unfavorable in the long term. So white spruce, red spruce, and eastern white cedar, and 3 other species who are expected to have favorable long-term habitat conditions: sugar maple, eastern white pine, and red pine. The 3 other cases are cases of assisted range expansion, as Tyler explained, since they are expected to have new favorable habitat conditions in that bioclimatic domain, and that the species are present under the current conditions. So we planted there black cherry, northern red oak, and shagbark hickory. So what's going on with these seedlings? How are they doing? Well, we are very glad to report that we found a very good survival rate after 3 growing seasons with 89% survival. The survival was slightly lower for the shagbark hickory with 79%, and for black cherry with 82%. So these are two new species in this ecosystem. So that's not very surprising, but still is good. And despite the high survival rate, however, we observed that half of live trees are actually have defects or damage. The most frequent defect was the leader damage with 42% of damaged trees. And this category includes the death of the apical stem, but also forks in multiple leaders. In the field, we observed that leader damage was largely caused by late frost. We also had a 22% of defects from natural causes, abiotic stress, insects, and disease, as well as 11% of damaged seedlings by browsing, as you can see on this photo. When looking at the main defect, the leader damage, this one was more often observed on hardwood species. For instance, the red oak, the sugar maple, and the hickory. We observed in the field, we had the late frost events for 2 springs in a row in 2020 and 2021. Last year's frost was especially spectacular. Actually, what happened is that we had a early spring, the snow cover melted, and the bud break was initiated early. But at the end of May, there was a late frost who damaged part of the seedlings who had not completed their leaf out. And this is, I think, an interesting aspect of this project, and it's going to be investigated more in depth by one of the graduate students that are working on this, which is Thais Reis. One other thing I wanted to say is that our preliminary analysis indicated that for red oak, these damages were more frequent in the patch clear cut than under the partial cover of the shelter wood. And we also wonder what will be the long-term effects of this on the production and the quality of these trees if this happens repeatedly. Regarding the growth performance, the cutting treatment effects was by far the most important on diameter size after 3 years. All species, except for sugar maple and hickory, grew better in the clear cut than the clear cut full light conditions than under the shelter wood. Well, it's not really a surprise, but it's interesting. And you can see also that the magnitude of effects was more very important for the pines and for the spruces, like this. The pines almost doubled their size in the clear cuts. Mechanical brushing also had an effect on the diameter size. It increased the diameter size for the spruces, the pines, cedar, and oak, although it was a lesser extent that with the cutting treatments. For the spruces and white pine, the diameter growth varied in interaction with the cutting and the weeding treatments. And here we have an example for white spruce of this interaction, where the weeding had a greater effect in the clear cut than in the shelter wood. For the red spruce and white pine, the weeding only significantly increased the diameter in the clear cut and no effect in the shelter wood. So I think they've been quick, but we'll have time for questions, I guess. So up to now, results are very encouraging, but it's still early to conclude on the success of the assisted migration trials, but still it's quite encouraging. Most of seedlings still benefit of the protection of the snow during the winter, so they are maybe less browse and maybe have less damage as well. So it will be interesting to follow this in the long term. We saw during this talk that coniferous, black cherry, and red oak seedlings grew better in full sunlight. and conifers and red oak benefited of release from the understory competition. However, some species like red oak and sugar maple may acclimate better under partial cover. And I didn't talk really about the effects of analogues, but there was not really nothing much coming out up to now, but we'll see in the long term what happens. And finally, we have this work is a continued effort. We have really nice collaborations, especially with Université Laval, with a couple of grad students studying different aspects in phenology, browsing, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, social acceptability. And yeah, I want to acknowledge different persons who've been working on that. And thank you very much.
Yeah, so I just want to kick things off and acknowledge my collaborators here, namely Tony D'Amato has really led a lot of the charge behind this work. He was my PhD advisor when I worked on this, and now I'm a postdoc working with a number of collaborators, including Tony and others, on similar work. And today I'll be summarizing some of the outcomes. Really marries pretty well with what Patricia just spoke a bit about, and as well as Tyler, thinking about transitioning species composition based on future adaptability. And so just to build a little bit of a foundation here, as many of us recognize, species ranges are changing, but migration rates fail to track that of climate change. But in the northeastern US, recent species distribution models really highlight the Northeast as a potential hotbed for migration. So with broad increases in those species that are currently on site that may naturally infill or be enriched over time, but even larger increases in the species habitat, species that are not on site, potentially necessitating the need for assisted migration in this region of up to 10 to 20 species. And so in contrast to, say, our friends to the north or to the south or even to the west, in northeastern US, planting trees and artificial regeneration really isn't a huge part of our forestry culture, as we have such strong natural regeneration in our hardwood regions. And so this really leaves us with few empirical evaluations that are operational in scale and easily translatable for managers, especially those that incorporate a diverse suite of species. So this work is part of the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change, or ASK project. This is an international experiment of managers and scientists co-developing a common adaptation framework based around these ideas that folks are probably familiar with, of resistance, resilience, or transition. And so the work I'm presenting on today really falls within this idea of transitioning species composition to be a bit more future adapted. And so the work that I'm presenting on isn't part of this larger international effort, but largely in the northeastern region on land owned by Dartmouth College. So the goals of this work were to empirically test the performance of mixed species adaptation plantings in a live fire environment in the woods as part of silvicultural systems that represent how folks are managing forests in this region. Our treatments vary and reflect that climate change response framework: resistance, resilience, transition. They're replicated 4 times within 40 hectare, 100 acre blocks, each treatment being around 25 acres each. And then planted seedlings are within the transition treatments. This can be termed maybe a continuous cover, or regular shelter wood, or a variable density thinning. And we've planted seedlings within various size harvest gaps. So there's 16 gaps that are planted that represent a 1 acre or 0.4 hectare or 0.1 hectare or quarter acre gap sizes. And so this ASK experiment takes place in a northern hardwood forest, but we've also replicated this as well as in 2 other dominant forest types in the region. So a richer northern hardwood site, as well as in a Acadian mixedwood, both of these sites being in Vermont, USA. These Vermont sites being a bit more operationally constrained. And so we tested them within 3 reps of just the quarter acre gap sizes. And then thinking about the role of gap size and light, building off of what Patricia was just mentioning in their study design, relative to those species that are currently on site, those species that are future climate adapted based on species distribution models really have a much lower shade tolerance. And so providing canopy openings through silviculture that are much favor higher light environments is really the driving silvicultural decision. So there are 9 species tested here that were selected democratically from managers and scientists using a co-development process. So not just leaning on species distribution models, but really thinking about what species may fare best using local knowledge of these sites. But really considerable emphasis placed on the functional attributes and redundancy of those species against those species in the region that are maybe projected to decline. And so despite model projections indicating to the demise of spruce or even hemlock, they've been included as they confer important functional attributes, as well as they many parts of these regions actually may serve as a bit of a refugia for them. And so you can see that I've coded each of these species by a migration type, those that are population enrichment, they're within their range, maybe make up a lesser proportion of the current forest, and then range expansion species. So modest movements outside of their range, maybe a little bit more of analogous to a assisted migration trial. And so unlike the excellent work previously presented, this experiment doesn't control for the role of provenance, rather it's focused on the differences between a diverse suite of species and those interspecies differences, and really capturing those conditions that are readily available for foresters who are getting their seedlings from commercial tree nurseries, which I'll talk a bit more about later. And so we census these seedlings 100% annually for growth, survival, other factors affecting their performance. And likewise, we have a split plot design with seedlings caged for browse and herbivory, as well as mowing around half of them for competition release. And you can really start to see that vegetative competition coming in strong in year 3 and then year 4, overtopping this field technician. So this 4.5-year response, these are measurements from just the other day. So around 5,600 seedlings planted regionally. We have a mean survivalship of around 52%. The figure on your right here, these are Cox proportional hazard of regression curves. So these are a regression curve for an individual species. So predicted survival on the Y, time in months on the X. And so the main takeaways here are that those tolerant species, red spruce, red oak, white pine, really pulling up the top in terms of highest levels of survivalship. And those intolerant species, black cherry, American chestnut, big-tooth aspen, black birch, and bitternut hickory here, really pulling up the rear in terms of lowest levels of survivalship. Within species, growth and survival was relatively consistent regionally with some separation in that performance, and that's largely driven by a few factors. So when our seedlings were planted, they were planted during a 99th percentile or once in a century drought. And so regional differences in rainfall really led to higher mortality rates on some sites which didn't receive rainfall for nearly 2 weeks after planting. And so in thinking from a forester's perspective, this really represents a potential future climate analog that folks may be working in. And then in our Vermont sites, which are a bit smaller operationally with higher browse pressure, we saw about twice as much browse in many of these sites, given that it concentrated that food source relative to maybe the larger ASCC study, so some separation there. And as illustrated by Tyler earlier, we're really seeing this, this growth and survival trade-off associated with different growth strategies of our species planted. So in looking at those same species Tyler looked at, so with respect to our oaks, we see higher rates of survivalship given the allocation towards below ground structures of this species, followed by low initial above ground growth of that species. In contrast, relative to big-tooth aspen, with its life history trait revolving around high initial growth rates at the cost of lower survivalship, at least in the short term, likely due to its shade intolerance and being outcompeted. So when we look at a combined metric of both growth and survival, the brief outcome here is that those population enrichment species are faring quite a bit better than those assisted migration or range expansion species. So we use generalized linear mixed effects models to look at some of the primary drivers of growth and survival. And really the main outcomes here is initial size plays an important role in seedling growth and survival. So larger species are surviving at higher rates, but they're also dying back at higher rates due to greater transpirational stress in these exposed harvest gaps. Species and really their functional traits play an important role in moderating this. So say the capacity for hardwood to resprout after dieback. And really the primary driver here, microsite variability in the form of local vegetation, plays a very important role. So In the short term, the refugia of woody residuals in these gaps fosters higher survival, but really over the longer term, local vegetation competition is really the greatest biophysical driver that negatively controls both growth and survival. And so more conceptually, as we think about this idea of ecological memory, this has oftentimes been used to describe an ecosystem's response in the form of the material or informational legacies that persist after a disturbance. And so it's oftentimes used to describe a type of ecological resilience to transitions. So what we show is a strong, that the naturally occurring vegetative competition here play a significant role in negatively affecting both the growth and the survival of our experimental plantings here. And so the results indicate that the legacy of ecological memory on these sites may actually confer some level of resistance to our goals of transitioning species composition. And so thinking about the long-lived nature of forests, this inertia is something we expect to carry forward and potentially continue to protract or lag our response for assisted migration. So now there are many factors that can alter and erode ecological memory: drought, invasive species, and one thing we observed is how elevated browse pressure can reduce the strength of that vegetative competition. And so something we witnessed within this pattern was how browse affected the site memory across some of our regional sites differently, such that those species that were transplanted in our experiment that were less palatable to browsers were actually favored under these reduced competition environments. Switching gears a little bit and thinking about in the context of assisted migration, the risks associated with maladaptation are frequently highlighted. And so to demonstrate this, I use our American chestnut here. This species within our species tested really represents the longest distance source transfer of any species we tested, from Virginia all the way up to northern New Hampshire. And so the results of this are repeated winter injury due to extreme temperatures and reduced growth associated with a proportion of that stem damage. And so for chestnut, there are a few reproductively viable disease-resistant trees that remain along its northern margins of its historic range. And so restoration efforts often must rely on sources more core to its range. But provenance and source availability really isn't just a challenge for specialized species like chestnut. It's really cross-cutting across species that we've tested. And this includes northern red oak, which is the most commonly reproduced deciduous tree species in commercial tree nurseries in the US. And so what this figure depicts is red oak's range in gray overlaid over potential seed zones in different polygons. These seed zones are a combination of eco-provinces and cold hardiness zones. And then in green, these green polygons represent the number of sources from these seed zones that are sold in commercial tree nurseries available from this year for forestry applications as opposed to landscape purposes. And the outcome here is that less than 15% of these potential seed zones are represented for foresters to be able to buy. And so this trend in inadequate seed source availability is further exacerbated for all of the other species that we've been looking into. So the takeaway here is, unlike our friends to the north with strong and well-developed nursery infrastructure to grow and sell a variety of species, stock sizes, seed sources, in the US, we really lack this nursery capacity to be able to support operational scale planting efforts for adaptation, assisted migration, and other broadly proposed reforestation efforts like the Trillion Tree Initiative. So in conclusion, some of the summary points from my talk today are, despite model projections and habitat shifts, assisted migration of species really lag behind the performance of those species that we've planted that are a bit more locally adapted. Now, there are many factors that can control the performance of these planted species, namely stock, as well as the functional attributes of these species, namely shade tolerance, the capacity to be able to resprout. But the primary factor here controlling response is the long-lasting legacy of ecological memory in the form of that heavy vegetative competition. Within these broadly proposed climate adaptation frameworks, a blanket transition in terms of ecosystem composition still remains a bit of a challenge, but the success may not lie in a wholesale transition in species composition, rather in terms of a near-term survival of a few sexually mature individuals along strategically placed source nodes that can serve to functionally strengthen a network at stand and landscape levels for dispersal over the long term, which like what Christian Messier and Tony and D'Amato and Brian Palick have talked about here. So just close with a few highlights of some manuscripts that outline some of this work, and to celebrate this manuscript right here that was accepted today, led by Brian Palick, that summarizes some of this work and really looks at some of the operational constraints of assisted migration in this region. So with that, thank you all, and I don't know if I have any time for questions.
So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about our installment of the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change study in Petawawa. Feeling elevated levels of imposter syndrome here. I'm going to be presenting mostly the process we went through and not so much any specific scientific results today. Pete sort of crushed a bunch of my presentation by including all this great information about Ask, and so while he was doing that, I was cutting slides to hopefully gain some time for discussion later. And so really what we're trying to do is build on a lot of the existing science on adaptive assisted migration and adaptive silviculture and implement it in an operational scale trial. That's what the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change is. Our trial takes place in the Petawawa Research Forest, which is just outside of Ottawa in Ontario. The forest is first of all on sandy glacial outwash soils. It is dominated by white pine and red pine, but also has significant components of red oak, white birch, various poplars, and the scourge of our existence, balsam fir. And so it's a pretty diverse site. It is prone to droughty conditions in the summer, and it experiences a whole series of disturbances, including fire, ice, and wind damage. And so regeneration in these species and forest structure is very diverse, similar to hardwood regions in the further south and east of us. So the climate is changing, as we know, and is expected to be change dramatically in our region over the next several decades. The average temperature and precipitation are expected to increase significantly. However, the moisture index is supposed to decrease significantly over time. And depending on which RCP scenario you choose and which path society chooses to take to combat climate change, it may get to the point where it gets close to not being able to support closed canopy forests. So a climate moisture index of 0, for example, can no longer support a closed canopy forest. And so after conducting a vulnerability assessment, we came to the conclusion that climate change impacts on our forests is going to be strong enough and impactful enough that some of our species were in danger of falling out. And red pine was one of those species that was significantly declining. And so climate change presents some challenges for silviculture and forestry because we don't know with any certainty what the future condition will be like or what it's supposed to be like or any of those things. We don't know necessarily what the predominant disturbance regime will be, how frequently, how intense, and there are a whole bunch of unknowns in there. And so the best we can do is to try and set ourselves up to create diverse and healthy forests into the future, and that'll best respond to the change in climatic conditions. And so as was mentioned earlier, the ask experiments are based on 3 sort of major treatment ideas: resistance, resilience, and transition, where resistance is you improve the defenses of a forest against change and maintain a relatively unchanged species composition and structure. Resilience is where you accommodate some degree of change, but where you return to some sort of prior ecological condition. And so you're looking to accommodate a little bit of change and push it into a more resilient direction. And then transition is really where you're accepting your fate and trying to push that stand into a state that you think is going to be more realistic for the future climate envelopes and future climate conditions. And so that could be changing species composition entirely or forest structure. So at the ASK trial at PRF, we're focused on sort of the long-term management of eastern white pine forests. And we have those 3 main treatments in there, but we've also added sort of a business as usual control, because we do manage our eastern white pine through uniform shelter wood and plant them with local seed stock for, the last 100 or so years. And we've gotten pretty good at it. So we'd like to contrast sort of these other treatments to what we do normally, as well as a undisturbed control. And so the resistant treatment is really looking at maintaining white pine, but introducing some southern seed sources. The resilience treatment is a irregular shelter wood with expanding gaps, something sort of new to Ontario that people are super uncomfortable with for some reason. But through sort of stubbornness alone, I managed to push this through our committee and get it in there. And we're going to be planting sort of white pine from southern sources, as well as some red oak from various sources, and then introducing some white oak from southern seed sources, which typically don't exist in any abundance in the Petawawa region. And the transition is really that case where we're saying, you know what, white pine doesn't have a future here, which it might not, and we want to plant a sort of a replacement species, and something that may work better and is more adapted to those drier conditions than from southern locations. And so we're going to put in some pitch pine, as well as some southern sourced white oak and red oak as well. Oops. And so we have a bit of a conundrum here, in that we're sort of on an island here, and we have these 3 sort of themes of resistance, resilience, and transition, and utilizing alternative seed sources a key component of our experiment, but we are pretty isolated from southern seed sources. And there's a big process to figure out where to go and how to get the seed. And so the rest of this presentation will focus on sort of what to do about the fact that, we don't have access to southern seed sources very much. And so the seed selection strategy followed sort of a pretty typical methodology, adaptation strategy, where you can have assisted population migration or migration within the range, where you're moving things, for example, in our case, from sort of a southern Ontario to Petawawa in the terms of white pine or red oak. You can have assisted range expansion, where you're moving things really to the northern edge of their range and past where the northern edge of their range is normally, maybe a little bit. And then we have long distance migration, which is, for our case, like the pitch pine, where we're moving it completely way outside of its normal range, where it normally exists and is happy. And so, as I said before, the 3 treatments that we're employing really do use all 3 of those sort of different range expansion sort of long-range migration and sorry, I need some water here. And long-range migration. And so we're trying to mix and match these things to give ourselves the best chance of success to have a strong and resilient forest into the future, and really hoping that sort of the diversity and having things from multiple seed zones will interact together, and through time, you know, as things succeed and fail, that, you know, we'll still have forests there in 50 years. And so one of our big problems is that we have to, for a lot of our seed sources, we have to reach down into the United States. And as Pete was mentioning, there's not always a great network of seed available to us. And, you know, because we've been working mostly in Central Ontario for the last 100 or so years, we don't have the contacts or the context to deal with sort of finding that seed and bringing it here. There's a lot of obstacles in our way. There's phytosanitary restrictions and import restrictions and all sorts of these things that, you know, we've never had to deal with. And the industry at large in this part of the country has never ever had to really look into how to do this. And so we thought that part of this experiment would be to do this at an operational scale and to start to develop and build some of those relationships. And we reached out to Forestry and Conservation Association and our National Tree Seed Center to help gain some expertise and some contact with some of these southern seed providers. And together with their collective experience, they're able to reach out to the different states and the different parts of the province and manage to get all of the seeds and the seed sources that were required. In theory, they've yet to arrive. And so as a result of this sort of process that we went through and sort of deciding what we needed and where we needed it from and working with our collaborators, sort of what we found is that, you know, we still have a bunch of challenges if we're going to roll this out sort of at a provincial level or at an operational scale, and that we need to make these national and international connections. We need trusted sources with known genetics, known locations, and we need to know, you know, where the seeds are available from, what the supply is, how much we can get, and how reliable it is. Can we get it every year? Can we count on that supply? And, you know, we have to work through the logistics on how much of the seed and how to ship it and dormancy requirements and all the jurisdictional regulations that go along with, you know, trying to get living material across a border, which is not always easy. But it really does represent a whole bunch of opportunities for us, sort of as a CFS and Wood Fiber Center, but also for our partner organizations, and allows us to create greater networks and work together to hopefully leverage funding and experience in order to help prepare and establish seed orchards and establish new seed orchards and sources of seed. And, you know, if you build it, perhaps they will come, or if we need it, perhaps they'll build it, I guess. And so we really are looking forward to formalizing some of these partnerships and then to start creating more of these test sites across Ontario to sort of demonstrate that it is possible. There is a process that we can go through to do this. We have partners and networks available, and hopefully we can make this happen. So that's it for me.
Thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this and including us. We're going to take a bit of a detour here into urban systems. And before getting started, I just want to acknowledge my co-authors and really say that I am presenting here on their behalf, that this is collaborative work that is a whole team effort. I come to you and will speak about work in Minnesota Makoche. This is the land of the Dakota people, and the Dakota are part of the larger Ochechi-Shakowin, which stretched across some of the central part, this area on the map. Many of you may be more familiar with this map and the place that we call Minnesota today, which is in the central part of North America. I will be talking about work in a region called the Bedote. This is a place where two rivers meet, Hahawakpa, which is the Mississippi River, and the Minnesota River. This place is the center of the Dakota origin story, and our research sites work is within a matrix of a number of sacred places. This is unceded territory, and that many of us might know this better as the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area in Minnesota, USA. I'm going to use this work in this place to bring assisted migration and adaptive silviculture into an urban setting. I want to start with thinking about what are urban forests. I'm going to use this definition: trees within an urban area, including trees along streets, in backyards, as well as stands of remnant forest within the urban network. Now, there's many benefits of urban forests. They range from enhancing public health, recreation, social cohesion, to supporting biodiversity and mitigating urban heat islands by providing cooling and shade. I think urban forests present both challenges and opportunities to forests and to studying forests. Urban forests are stressful. They experience air pollution. In our cold climate space, salt is an issue that the trees have to deal with. They tend to be hotter than the rest of the region in which they occur due to urban heat island effects, which then is layered on climate change. But I also think urban systems present opportunities. First off, they are high biodiversity compared to surrounding areas, and so we can ask interesting questions associated with biodiversity and actually with species that have already been moved. And they also have high concentrations of people, and this leads to lots of opportunity for volunteer engagement as well as community science and education. It's important to remember when we talk about urban forests that actually we're talking about two pretty distinct components of the urban forest that have different issues and different management. Street trees and developed sites compared to natural areas or those remnant forests I mentioned in the introduction. Now, our project focuses on remnant forests, natural areas within the Mississippi River floodplain. These are typically managed by city or regional park departments. The trees are generally naturally occurring and are more or less left alone. They tend to be local trees, native trees, although sometimes we have non-local species there. And there's pretty low investment per tree in terms of the management for these sites. Floodplains are what they sound like. They are areas along rivers that are seasonally flooded. This is just an image of our site to show that context of urban areas up actually on bluffs, in this case, above the river, and then the river flows through, and our sites are in floodplain forest in that lower area. Our site has some really specific challenges associated with the site, but I think also that link into floodplain forests in general. It has altered hydrology due in part to water controls, structures like lock and dams, and these facilitate and enable the transportation function of the Mississippi River, but it also affects the dynamics of the forest because it changes the natural flooding regimes. We also have this non-local being, this invasive species called emerald ash borer. And emerald ash borer is killing native ash trees within the urban area. When you have a managed street tree, often cities will take that out in these remnant forests, you get what you see in this picture here, which is massive dieback and huge areas of our field site with dead trees. And then these dead trees facilitate, actually at this point, being filled by vines, grasses, and plants other than trees. Layered on these issues is climate change. In our region, climate change really means on average wetter conditions and warmer conditions, but also greater extremes. So more likelihood of drought, more likelihood of big rain events, which creates long-lasting floods. One of our field site one year was flooded through mid-July, which is very unusual. But we still also have cold, so polar vortex will dip down, and so we still get those very cold temperatures here, and these all present challenges in terms of thinking about what's next. And we're really thinking about, and we're forced to think about what's next at these floodplain sites when the ash came in, killing trees, because of this site as really an important recreational site. It's the largest park in the city's park district. It hosts over 500,000 visitors every year to this site. And those people have really strong place connections to our field sites. And the loss of trees is something that is really personal and emotional and can be very disruptive. And so that really pushed us into this project and this question that we have, which is how can we help these floodplain forests in the urban context adapt to a changing climate and maintain the variety of services that they provide. We worked with the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change Network, which has been introduced already, but in case people came in late, ASK is a collaborative effort to establish a series of experimental silvicultural trials across a network of sites. One of the major goals is really to co-develop robust operational examples of how to integrate climate change into adaptation and silvicultural planning and the on-the-ground actions that are really happening. The process of ASK begins really with a project design workshop, and the idea of these workshops is bringing together scientists, managers, to develop and ways that you're to test silviculture approaches to management. And in our case, our workshop included tribal, federal, U.S. federal, Minnesota state, and city managers, such as the Prairie Island Indian Community, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Forest Service, the Army Corps of Engineers, National Park Service, Minnesota DNR, City of St. Paul, lots of different folks there, along with our university partners. The design of all of these really tests this spectrum of adaptation options, ranging from reducing impacts and maintaining current conditions to really this forward-looking, active, promoting change component. And so we had to, as a group, think about what does this look like in floodplains? What does this look like in an urban area? And what we ended up doing in this case was focusing on our species and our seed source choices to implement these treatments. So we basically were picking a set of species to plant into these gaps created by tree death due to emerald ash borer. And so our resistance treatment used species that were local to our area with sources from nurseries local to our area. Our resilience treatment included sources from a plant hardiness zone south of us, so nurseries in a different hardiness zone. And largely these were species that actually occurred in our area, but the source was from further south. In one case, the Sycamore, the Platanus occidentalis, is one of, we would consider this not a population migration, but actually that assisted species migration. And then finally, our transition treatment included sources from nurseries from an even further south seed zone, plant hardiness zone, And it included a lot more species that represent really this assisted species migration, where we're moving things like Liriodendron tulipifero, the tulip tree, outside of its range to our sites. And you will notice along the bottom that we kind of kept a local silver maple across all of them, just as a bit of a, do we have any, you know, block or patch or context specific changes there. So the study design, again, I said those were in gaps. So we had 24 circular 1/10 acre plots. We planted big stock. So one of the issues that we had learned in the floodplain is with these long floods that have become more common, small stock is going to be completely submerged. So we actually planted 3 to 6 foot tall bare root stock, big trees, into these gaps. And we have 3 replicates or 6 replicates across 3 zones. These were planted in May and June by 2020 by a suite of volunteers. And I'll talk a little bit more about I'll be kind of highlighting the role of volunteers and then end with some comments about our volunteers. We measure temperature continuously, both of the soil and of the air. We do weekly phonology measurements because by the timing of things like bud break, leaf out, flowering, leaf drop, we think are important and are things that may be very different among these different seed sources, and and thus is important to monitor. We also measure annual survival, growth, and condition. Now we're only a couple years in. We have 2 growing seasons, so these are pretty preliminary results, and I don't have a ton of them. So far, we have quite high survival of our species. Our transition has the lowest levels of survival, and that actually grows out of just 2 species that had quite poor survival. The southern source river birch and the tulip poplar, the Liriodendron, and both of those we actually think are more related to stock than origin, than climate of origin, because the material we got from the nurseries was of quite poor quality. What's interesting, and we haven't fully assessed this, and some of the other talks made me think about ways of thinking about this, is that actually a number of the trees have taught that dieback and resprouting, and so it'll be interesting, and I'm interested now after hearing some of these other talks and really looking at assessment of that across these different treatments, which I don't think we've done yet, as we're just starting to get into the data. I want to just show some growth examples because I think I'm running out of time. I may be going over time. And that is just highlight 2 things. One, we have these silver maples from 2 different zones, and we actually see that the local stock seems to have stronger growth, although when we relativize this, that may not come out. And then I just want to highlight sycamore. This is one of our big transition species, assisted species migration, and it is sort of our best grower. It's our largest tree out there after 2 years, and appears to be really successful in this particular environment, despite being moved a pretty decent distance. Last data slide is on phonology, and this is a bit of a teaser, just suggesting we are seeing differences among our sources in terms of their phonology and in a direction expected, with our more southern species having later bud burst in this case, likely due to differences in their cues such as photoperiod and the accumulation of temperature. And then finally, I just want to close with kind of highlighting one of the benefits of the urban area is being able to engage volunteers. And we've engaged hundreds of volunteers. We've had over 700 volunteer shifts and more than 2,000 hours of service by volunteers. And then in closing, I want to talk about our final kind of product at this point, and that is we're sharing educational products as well as growing relationship that advances our kind of acknowledgement, land acknowledgement goals, going beyond kind of how I started my presentation. These beautiful pieces of art were made by Willard Mailbear, who was a Dakota artist, and we have Dakota and Anishinaabe interpretation of our experiment led by an Indigenous-led organization called the Lower Failing Creek Project. Moving forward, we are going to continue to monitor the project and ask questions on physiology and phonology, but we also have started into conversation and building relationship and trust such that we can bring Indigenous voices, particularly Dakota voices, and their needs and concerns into our work, since we are working in a very sacred place for those communities. And so with that, I'm just gonna thank my collaborators again, and I think now it's time that everyone gets to ask questions of all of the speakers in our group. So thank you so much for listening and for letting me go over a bit.